January 14, 1942. Off the coast of Long Island, two torpedoes slam into the freighter Norness and split her open. 8,000 tons of steel burn against the New York skyline, while the city's lights blaze on, oblivious. Sailors leap into freezing black water. A German U-boat captain lowers his binoculars and smiles. He has just fired the opening shot of a slaughter that will sink hundreds of ships within sight of American beaches. Berlin believes this is how the war ends. They are about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The man who breaks them is not a general. He is not an admiral. He is a welder. His hands are scarred from molten steel, his lungs full of shipyard smoke, and his name will never appear in a single Nuremberg document. But in the next 1,200 days, men like him will build 2,700 ships. They will launch one complete ocean freighter in 4 days, 15 hours and 26 minutes. They will replace every ton the Germans sink and then double it. And the moment the German High Command understood this, they knew the war was already lost. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next exciting videos. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Come with us into history. But before the ships, there was the darkness. And in that darkness, the killing had already begun. Turn back to the winter of 1941. Adolf Hitler stands at a rostrum in the Reichstag and declares war on a country 3,000 miles across the ocean. He does not have to. No treaty forces his hand. He does it because he is certain that America is soft, certain that a nation of shopkeepers and immigrants and squabbling politicians cannot fight. His generals agree. Their reading of the last war says American soldiers arrived too late to matter, that the factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh are real, but slow, that steel takes years to become a warship. Distance is Germany's greatest ally. Distance means time, and time favors the Reich. Admiral Karl Dönitz commands the U-boat fleet from a concrete bunker at Lorient on the French coast. He has done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic is beautiful. Sink more ships than the enemy can build. Sustain that rate. Britain starves within a year. The American buildup in Europe becomes impossible before it begins. His planners set the magic number at 700,000 tons destroyed every month. Reach it, hold it, and the Atlantic becomes a graveyard the Allies cannot cross. So he sends his hunters west. Operation Drumbeat. 5 long-range submarines cross the Atlantic in 3 weeks and arrive off an American coast that is still living in peacetime. There are no blackouts. Tourist towns refuse to dim their lights because darkness is bad for business. Freighters sail alone on published schedules, following sea lanes printed in pre-war almanacs. Tankers loaded with fuel steam north from the Gulf, their black hulls perfectly outlined against the glow of coastal cities. For a German submarine crew, it is not a battle. It is target practice. They call it the second happy time. Through the first months of 1942, U-boats sink ship after ship after ship. Cape Hatteras becomes known as Torpedo Junction. Bodies and oil wash onto Florida beaches while tourists watch. One submarine crew reports watching automobile headlights move along the coastal highway at night, so close are they to the shore. The tonnage climbs. 500,000 tons, 600,000. And then in June, the number crosses 700,000. The exact figure Dönitz's planners had marked as the point of no return, the threshold of victory. In Lorient, the submarines return with pennants flying from their conning towers, one for every ship they killed. Dönitz greets each crew personally. The Knight's Cross is handed out faster than in any period of the war. Hitler, briefed at his headquarters, expresses satisfaction with the naval war for one of the very few times in the entire conflict. The math is working. The distance is holding. The enemy cannot possibly replace what is being destroyed. Every projection Berlin has ever run confirms it. And this is the trap. Because the men in that bunker are counting the wrong thing. They are counting steel that already exists. They have no idea that thousands of miles away on the empty mudflats of California and Maine and Maryland, ordinary people are about to rewrite the rules of what a nation can build. His name does not survive. He is one of tens of thousands, so let us call him what he was, a welder. Before the war, he might have fixed farm machinery in the Midwest, or laid pipe, or done nothing skilled at all. Some of the people who would soon be building warships had never seen the ocean. Many were women who had never held a torch. Many were sharecroppers who had never earned a real wage. They came to a place called Richmond, California, where a man named Henry Kaiser was doing something the experts said was impossible. Kaiser was not a shipbuilder. He built roads. He built dams, the great concrete walls that tamed western rivers. He knew nothing about ships, and crucially, he did not care that he knew nothing. Because the traditional way of building a ship, the way every proper shipyard had done it for a century, involved skilled craftsmen taking many months to rivet a hull together plate by plate, hammering millions of red-hot rivets one at a time. It was an art. It required a lifetime to master. And Kaiser looked at that ancient art and decided to destroy it. His idea was simple, and to the old shipbuilders insane. Do not rivet the ship. Weld it. Melt the steel plates directly together in continuous seams faster and with far less skill, and do not build the ship in one place from the keel up. Build it in pieces all across the country in factories that had never touched the sea. Bridge sections in one state. Deckhouses in another. Engines somewhere else. Prefabricate every giant chunk, ship them by rail to the water's edge, and then assemble the whole vessel like a child's construction set. The old guard laughed. Welded ships would crack, they said. They would break apart in heavy seas. You cannot trust a farmer's daughter with a welding torch to build something that must survive the North Atlantic. It was reckless. It was a shortcut. It was, they insisted, a recipe for sending men to the bottom. The design itself, 5 basic hull plans. Ugly, slow, functional was mocked. One official called the standardized freighter an ugly duckling. Even President Roosevelt reportedly thought it was a homely thing. Nobody in Berlin considered it a threat, because nobody in Berlin imagined that ugly and fast could beat elegant and slow. But here is what the welders understood in their scarred hands, and what the admirals never grasped. You do not need a genius to lay a perfect weld. You need 1,000 ordinary people, each taught to do one small piece perfectly, working in a rehearsed sequence like a factory line. Kaiser took the assembly line logic of the automobile plant and pointed it at the sea. He did not need master craftsmen. He needed electricity steel and the raw determination of people who had been told their whole lives that they were nobody. So, the reckless experiment began. On mudflats that had held nothing but marsh grass, Kaiser's crews poured concrete slipways and threw up prefabrication sheds. There were shortages of everything. Not enough housing, so they built entire towns. Not enough workers, so they recruited from across the nation packing trains with people who had never held a steady job. Not enough trained welders, so they opened schools and taught the skill in weeks instead of years. The traditional shipyards watched with contempt, certain the whole circus would collapse. The tension was real. Would the welds hold? The first hulls went into the water, carrying the doubts of every expert in the industry. Then the numbers started coming in. A ship that once took a proper yard 8 months to build, Kaiser's people were finishing in a matter of weeks. And the time kept falling. 230 days became 100. 100 became 60. 60 became 42. Each hull taught them something, and every lesson was fed back into the line. And then came the stunt that told the world what was happening. In November of 1942, the workers at a Kaiser yard decided to prove a point. They pre-positioned the sections, they rehearsed every move, and they laid the keel of a freighter named the Robert E. Peary. 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes later, the completed ship slid down the ways into the water. A full ocean-going vessel, longer than a football field, built in under 5 days. It was a demonstration, yes, a carefully staged record. But the capability behind it was absolutely real, and the message it sent was unmistakable. The rules had changed. The reckless idea was not reckless anymore. It was a weapon. And the welders who built it were about to feed it into the Atlantic faster than the German submarines could ever hope to kill. The ships poured out. 18 shipyards across the country were now building these standardized freighters, the Liberty ships. In the first half of 1942, American yards launched 4 million tons of merchant shipping. In the second half, the rate climbed higher. And a strange thing began to happen in the loss reports arriving at Donitz's operations table in Lorient. The names were wrong. Among the ships sunk off Hatteras was a freighter, launched only weeks before her death. Among the tankers burning off Florida was one completed at the very end of 1941. German naval intelligence did not recognize the vessels because the vessels were new. They had never appeared in any pre-war registry. There was no record of them because they had not existed a month earlier. Donitz's staff logged the detail without alarm. The pattern still held. They were still sinking ships faster than the enemy could replace them. Every projection said so. But out in the mid-Atlantic, the numbers had begun to lie to the Germans. Because for every ship a U-boat destroyed off the American coast, 2 more were sliding into the water in California and Maine. The freighters the submarines were so proudly counting were being replaced before their oil slicks had even dispersed. The welders had turned shipbuilding into a river, and no submarine fleet on Earth could drink a river dry. Across the ocean, the German crews still sang, still flew their pennants, still believed the second happy time would last. They could not see the mudflats of Richmond. They could not hear the crackle of 10,000 welding torches burning through the California night. They did not know that a nation they had dismissed as soft was building an industrial machine that would outproduce the entire Axis in nearly every category that mattered: tanks, aircraft, trucks, ammunition, and above all, ships. By the summer, the tonnage the U-boats destroyed would be swallowed whole and forgotten, replaced many times over. The magic number of 700,000 tons a month, the threshold Donitz's planners had called the road to victory, was about to become meaningless. Because you cannot starve an enemy who builds faster than you can kill. The welders did not know they were changing the war. They knew they were tired. They knew the pay was good, and the hours were brutal, and the steel burned their skin. They knew that somewhere out on the black water, men were dying on the ships they built, and that the only answer was to build more and faster, and to never ever stop. And so the second happy time was about to curdle into the worst nightmare the German submarine fleet had ever known. The hunters were about to become the hunted. The illuminated waters off Long Island would go dark. The undefended coast would bristle with convoys and aircraft and radar. And the beautiful arithmetic that Karl Donitz had trusted for 3 years was about to reverse itself, ton by ton, ship by ship, until the very sailors who had smiled at the burning Norness would be diving for the ocean floor to survive. But the Germans still had a plan. If they could not win off the American coast, they would concentrate their wolf packs in the one place the aircraft could not reach, a stretch of the mid-Atlantic they called the Black Pit, the gap in the middle of the ocean where no plane could fly. There they believed they could still cut Britain's lifeline. There the killing could continue. There the war could still be won. They were wrong about that too. Because the same nation of welders and farmers and ordinary hands that had learned to build a ship in 4 days was already solving the Black Pit. New escort carriers, long-range bombers with a searchlight that could find a submarine in total darkness, a radar so precise it could spot a periscope through cloud. And a single month coming in the spring of 1943, so devastating that Donitz would lose 41 submarines, and with them any hope of victory. In Part 2, we will follow the ordinary men on the other side of this war, the escort crews and the pilots, into the Black Pit itself. We will watch convoy ONS-5 sail straight into more than 30 waiting U-boats in a battle that should have been a German massacre. We will see the moment the exchange rate reverses, the moment the hunters realize they are being slaughtered, and the exact night Karl Donitz sits in his bunker and gives the order he swore he would never give. But could the welders build fast enough to matter before Britain starved? And what happens when the German High Command finally sees the true American production numbers? The figures they had dismissed as propaganda laid out in cold ink on Albert Speer's desk. The welders had done the impossible. On the empty mudflats of California, Ordinary people who had never seen the ocean were building complete ocean freighters in weeks, welding steel where the old masters had riveted it, assembling ships like construction sets. One vessel, the Robert E. Peary, had slid into the water in under 5 days. But building a ship is one thing. Convincing the men who ran the war that a nation of amateurs could outproduce the greatest military machine on earth was something else entirely. And that fight was about to get uglier than anyone expected. Because for every believer, there were 10 men in suits and uniforms who thought the whole thing was a disaster waiting to happen, and they had evidence. The evidence was in the steel itself. Welded hulls the skeptics warned would not hold. And in the cold of the North Atlantic, they were sometimes right. Liberty ships began to crack. A handful split apart at sea, their hulls fracturing in freezing water, some breaking clean in two at the dock. To the old shipbuilders who had spent their lives riveting hulls plate by plate, this was proof. The welded ship was a coffin. The whole Kaiser method was a reckless shortcut that would drown American sailors faster than any German torpedo. Traditional yards demanded a return to the old ways, the slow ways, the proven ways. The pressure was crushing because time was the one thing nobody had. Out in the Atlantic, the U-boats were still winning. In 1942 alone, German submarines sent more than 6 million tons of Allied shipping to the bottom. Every month, the debate dragged on. More ships, burned more sailors, froze in oil, slicked water off Hatteras and Halifax. The men who wanted to slow down and do it properly were in the cold arithmetic of the sea, asking the country to lose. Inside the offices of the United States Maritime Commission, the argument reached a boiling point. The commission was led by Admiral Emery Scott Land, a naval officer who had spent decades around ships and who could have sided easily with the traditionalists. He did not. When his own engineers laid the cracking data on his desk, Land did not order the program stopped. He asked a different question. Are the ships getting to Britain? They were. For every hull that cracked, hundreds arrived intact, unloaded their cargo, and turned around for more. The failures were real, but they were fixable. Engineers traced the fractures to brittle steel and sharp-cornered hatch openings that concentrated stress in the freezing cold. The solution was not to abandon welding. It was to reinforce the weak points round the corners and improve the steel. It was a problem of engineering, not of philosophy. And engineering problems, Land understood, could be solved on a schedule that riveting never could. Land became the unexpected shield the welders needed. He had the credibility of a career admiral and the stubbornness to spend it defending a program the establishment mocked. But he was not the most powerful ally the ugly ships would find. That man sat in the White House. In January of 1942, weeks after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt stood before Congress and announced production targets that his own advisors privately believed were fantasy. 60,000 aircraft, 45,000 tanks, and 18 million tons of merchant shipping. The numbers were so large they seemed like propaganda, and in Berlin they were dismissed as exactly that, figures invented to frighten the enemy and reassure the British. Roosevelt did not care what Berlin thought. He had thrown the full weight of the presidency behind the impossible and behind the men like Kaiser who claimed they could deliver it. Now the welders had their orders. They had their defenders. What they did not yet have was proof that any of it would matter at sea. Because ships sitting in a harbor win nothing. The real test would come in the middle of the ocean, in the black water, where the U-boats hunted in packs in a place the German crews called the Black Pit. If the production miracle could not push its cargo through that gap in the Atlantic, then all the welding in California was worthless. And in the spring of 1943, the entire war came down to a single convoy. Its name was ONS-5. 42 merchant ships crawling west across the North Atlantic, low in the water, slow, vulnerable, escorted by a handful of warships. Karl Dönitz saw his chance. He concentrated more than 30 U-boats across the convoy's path, the largest wolf pack he had ever assembled against a single target. By every projection in his bunker at Lorient, this would be a massacre. The kind of slaughter that had made the Second Happy Time so glorious. He signaled his captains to attack. What followed was the climax of the entire Battle of the Atlantic. The weather was atrocious: storms and fog and mountainous seas that scattered the convoy and battered the escorts. For days the U-boats closed in and ships began to die. One freighter, then another, torpedoes tearing them open in the darkness. The escort crews, exhausted men who had been awake for days, fought back with everything the production miracle had given them. And that was the crucial difference. These were not the helpless freighters of 1942 sailing alone under bright coastal lights. These escorts carried new weapons, and the weapons had been built by the same industrial fury that was launching a Liberty ship every few days. They carried radar precise enough to find a surfaced submarine in fog and darkness. They carried direction finders that could fix a U-boat's radio signal within minutes of it transmitting. They carried a forward-firing mortar called the Hedgehog that threw a pattern of charges ahead of the ship, striking before the submarine could dive and turn away. And overhead, when the range allowed, came aircraft the U-boats could not escape. The battle turned in the fog. Escort captains hunting by radar drove their small ships straight at the submarines. One after another, the hunters became the hunted. A U-boat would surface to attack and find a warship already charging out of the murk, guns firing depth charges tumbling into the black water. The exchange rate, the sacred number that Dönitz had trusted for 3 years, reversed itself in a matter of days. When ONS-5 finally reached port, it had lost 13 merchant ships, a painful toll. But the convoy had gotten through, and in exchange the escorts had destroyed 6 U-boats and damaged many more. For the first time, the Germans had lost more killing power than they could afford, and the merchant ships they sank were being replaced faster than the submarines that sank them. Dönitz's own submarine crews had walked into the largest wolf pack of the war and come out bleeding. But one convoy was not the war. The doubters could still call ONS-5 an accident of weather and luck. The true test was whether it could happen again month after month until the U-boat fleet was ground to nothing. And that required more than clever weapons. It required numbers. It required the Black Pit itself to be closed, and only mass production could close it. So the deployment began in earnest, and it brought its own war. Escort carriers, small aircraft carriers built on merchant hulls in the same frantic yards that built the Liberty ships, began sailing with the convoys carrying their own aircraft into the middle of the ocean, where land-based planes could never reach. Long-range B-24 Liberator bombers, fitted with a searchlight bright enough to pin a surfaced U-boat in total darkness, took off from Iceland and Newfoundland and flew hundreds of miles out to sea. The Black Pit, the one refuge where German submarines had operated safely, was disappearing. Every month, more ships, more planes, more radar, more trained crews poured out of a country the German High Command had dismissed as soft. The old resistance had not vanished. There were still Navy officers who distrusted the merchant conversions, still commanders who wanted the aircraft used elsewhere, still traditionalists who believed the war would be won by battleships and not by ugly welded freighters and jury-rigged escort carriers. But the results silenced them. Where a convoy in early 1942 had crossed the Atlantic almost defenseless, a convoy in mid-1943 crossed inside a moving fortress of radar aircraft and warships, all of it manufactured at a speed that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. For the German crews, the change was terrifying and sudden. Submarines that surfaced at night to recharge their batteries were now caught in searchlights and blown apart before they understood what had found them. Radio messages to Lorient, once routine, now brought an aircraft screaming out of the clouds within the hour. Boats that had sailed a dozen successful patrols simply stopped returning. The confidence of the second happy time curdled into dread. Veteran commanders who wore the Knight's Cross vanished with their entire crews. And in the Lorient bunker, the casualty notices began to outnumber the medals. By the end of May 1943, the arithmetic had become a catastrophe for Germany. In that single month, Dönitz lost 41 U-boats. Crews who had trained for 2 years were gone in a matter of days. Among the dead was Dönitz's own son, killed aboard a submarine in the same battles that were destroying the fleet his father had built across a decade. On May 24th, the admiral did something he had sworn he would never do. He signaled his boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The campaign that had opened off the bright lights of Long Island had collapsed in less than 18 months. From an idea the experts had mocked as reckless welded ships built by farmers and housewives, the Allies had built the machine that broke the U-boat fleet. From cracked hulls and screaming skeptics, they had reached a moment where they could send a convoy into the largest wolf pack of the war and come out the winner. The ugly duckling had won its fight at sea, but winning the Atlantic was not the same as winning the war, because the true horror for the German High Command was not yet the battle reports. It was the full picture. The total production numbers still sitting in fragments across neutral embassies and intelligence intercepts waiting to be assembled. And one man in Berlin was about to gather them all onto a single desk. When Albert Speer, Hitler's own Minister of Armaments, finally checked the American figures and ordered them rechecked, he would discover something that no wolf pack and no wonder weapon could ever fix. The imbalance was not a battle. It was not a season. It was structural. And the moment he understood it, the most productive man in the Reich would quietly conclude that the war was already lost. One idea mocked as reckless. Welded ships built by farmers and housewives launched in days instead of months. Escort carriers and radar and searchlights all poured out of American yards faster than Germany could sink them. By May of 1943, that flood had broken the U-boat fleet and driven Karl Dönitz from the Atlantic. But out at sea, the Germans had only lost a battle. In Berlin, one man was about to lose something far worse. He was about to lose his belief that the war could be won. His name was Albert Speer, and when he finally assembled the American production figures on his desk, he ordered them rechecked twice. Then he understood. This was no longer a test of weapons. It was a machine that would not stop. Speer was 37 years old, an architect by training with no factories in his past and no naval experience at all. In February of 1942, Hitler had handed him control of armaments production across the entire Reich. To do his job, Speer needed one thing above all honest numbers: German output against Allied output category by category. And when those numbers began arriving through neutral embassies and signals intercepts, his staff refused to believe them. American aircraft production for 1942 was reported at 48,000 machines. German production that same year barely passed 15,000. Speer ordered the figures rechecked. They held. The shipping numbers were worse. Through the first half of 1942, American yards had launched 4 million tons of merchant shipping. In the second half, the rate climbed higher still. The Liberty ship, 5 simple hull designs welded not riveted prefabricated in pieces across a continent, was rolling into the water in weeks. Kaiser's yards alone accounted for a torrent of steel that German intelligence simply logged as fabrication because they had no framework to believe it. Then came the numbers that ended the argument. Where a proper yard once needed 8 months to build a freighter, the average Liberty ship in 1942 required about 230 days from keel to launch. By 1943, that average had collapsed to 42 days. 18 American shipyards were building these hulls at once. Germany had 4 major yards capable of anything comparable, and most of their capacity was already devoured by U-boat construction. Speer's planners could not reconcile it with any assumption they had ever made. The imbalance was not a bad season. It was structural. And Speer, the most productive man in the Reich, quietly concluded in the summer of 1943 that the war could no longer be won. But knowing you have lost and being allowed to say it are two different things. And Speer's crisis was only beginning, because the production miracle carried a hidden danger and it announced itself in blood over Germany. The same industrial fury that built ships was building bombers, and in August of 1943, the American 8th Air Force sent hundreds of B-17s to strike the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt, the choke point Speer feared most. The raid cost the Americans 60 bombers in a single day, a casualty rate that under every pre-war assumption should have ended the campaign. Any air force in the world would have stopped. The Americans came back in October. They lost 60 more, and still they did not stop. This was the crisis that broke German logic. Speer's planners had bet everything on the idea that losses would deter. Shoot down enough bombers, sink enough ships, and the enemy must eventually quit. But the replacement aircraft were already on the assembly lines before the burning wrecks hit the ground. By autumn, the 8th Air Force was fielding more bombers after each catastrophic raid than it had before. The formations over Germany did not shrink. They grew. Every month they grew larger until the sky itself became evidence of the numbers Speer had rechecked twice. Inside Germany, the blame began to fall. Why had the U-boats failed? Why had the factories not matched the enemy? Speer dispersed his plants under the bombing, prioritized fighter production, and drove output higher than anyone thought possible. His work extended the war. It did not change the outcome. And somewhere in those months, the German High Command stopped asking whether they could win and started asking only how long they could survive. Then came the event that made the answer visible from the ground. June 6, 1944. Normandy. The invasion fleet crossing the English Channel numbers nearly 7,000 vessels. It is the largest armada in human history, and almost every ship in it exists because of the production machine the Germans dismissed 2 years earlier. Landing craft, transports, escort carriers, Liberty ships loaded with tanks and fuel and ammunition. The sea is covered with them from horizon to horizon. On the German side, the defenders cannot believe the scale. Reconnaissance has failed them. The Luftwaffe cannot penetrate the Allied fighter screen, so the German command is half-blind, working from rumor and fragments. When the reports arrive, the figures are so large that the General Staff hesitates to accept them. The figures are accurate. The landings begin at dawn. Naval guns hammer the coast. Aircraft blacken the sky. Men pour out of the landing craft into fire. And then the Germans see the thing they were told could never cross the sea. Off the Normandy coast, the Allies assemble artificial harbors. Enormous prefabricated structures called mulberries, built in sections in Britain, and towed across the Channel piece by piece, are sunk into place within days. The Allies do not need to capture a port. They build one. On an open beach, in a week. It is the same logic that built the Liberty ship's prefabrication welding mass assembly, now pointed at the coast of France itself. The German response is strangled by exactly what Speer had measured. What the Luftwaffe cannot stop. What German industry cannot replace. Panzer divisions that move are hunted from the air. Reinforcements crawl toward the beaches through bombed roads and shattered rail lines. And across those artificial harbors, the flood arrives. Within 3 weeks, over 1 million Allied troops are ashore in France. Behind them come the trucks, the tanks, the fuel, the shells, an unbroken river of material fed by ships that Germany had counted on sinking faster than they could be built. Between January of 1943 and June of 1944, American yards had launched 27 million tons of merchant shipping. That single figure exceeds every ton the U-boat sank in the entire war, with millions of tons to spare. Every ship destroyed in the Atlantic had been replaced. Every replacement had been doubled. For the German soldiers holding the line in Normandy, the war changes character entirely. Before they had faced an enemy who could be stopped by killing enough of him. Now they face an enemy who arrives faster than he can be killed. A destroyed tank is replaced within days. A downed aircraft is one of 85,000 built that year. The math that Speer had rechecked on paper is now grinding through the hedgerows in steel. News of the beachhead races back to Berlin. The Atlantic Wall years in the building has been breached in hours and buried under a tide of material within weeks. And the tide does not stop at Normandy. It flows into everything. The strategic picture shifts across every front at once. On the Eastern Front, American Lend-Lease trucks, by the hundreds of thousands, give the Red Army a mobility. Germany cannot match hauling Soviet armies forward faster than the Wehrmacht can retreat. In the air over Germany, the bomber formations grow until they blot out the daylight. At sea, the U-boats that once ruled the Atlantic now die at a ruinous rate, losing roughly 1 boat for every 10,000 tons they sink. When early in the war, The ratio had been one boat for every 100,000 tons. Faster, larger, more relentless. The production machine has changed the exchange rate of the entire war. The propaganda in America seizes on it. The Liberty ship becomes a symbol of a nation that outbuilds its enemies. The welders, the riveters, the women who had never held a torch 2 years earlier, are celebrated as the force that is winning the war from 10,000 miles away. Morale on the Allied side climbs with every launch. On the German side, it drains away. Speer's own post-war words would confirm the collapse. By the summer of 1943. The comparative figures had permitted no plausible path to victory. Everything after was survival, dispersal, delay. Hitler still speaks of decisive weapons, jet fighters, larger submarines, the V-weapons. Speer sits in the conferences with the production schedules on his desk and knows the truth. None of them will arrive in time. None of them can. You cannot out-invent an enemy who outbuilds you 3-1 and rising. The German High Command had bet the war on the belief that American industry was real but distant, and that distance meant time. By the summer of 1944, the distance had been erased by the very ships they had counted on sinking, and the time had run out. From an idea the experts had called reckless welded hulls built by amateurs, the Allies had reached the beaches of France with a machine no army on earth could stop. The ugly duckling had won not a battle, not a campaign, but the industrial logic of the entire war. But the men who built it did not know they were making history. And the admiral who had unleashed the U-boats and the architect who had measured the defeat in numbers would both live to answer for what they had done. One of them was at that very moment sending men out to die in submarines he already knew were tombs. The other was drafting memoranda that told Hitler the war was lost and watching Hitler read them and do nothing. What happens to the men behind the machine? What becomes of the welder whose name history never recorded, of the admiral who lost his own son to the fleet he built, of the architect who knew the truth in 1943 and kept the factories running for 2 more years of death? The story of how America outbuilt the world has one final chapter, a chapter of reckoning and legacy that far fewer people know. And it ends strangely with a single ship still floating, still running her engines, waiting at a pier in San Francisco to tell the whole story to anyone who comes aboard. From a welder no one remembers to a fleet that broke the greatest submarine force on Earth. From an idea the experts called reckless welded ships built by farmers and housewives to 27 million tons of steel that no U-boat could ever sink fast enough. From the burning freighter off Long Island to 1 million men ashore in France. The production miracle had changed the entire logic of the war, and Albert Speer had measured its numbers with a rechecked, sinking certainty. But what happened to the men who lived it? What happened to the admiral who unleashed the submarines? The architect who counted the defeat? And above all, the ordinary hands who built the ships. This story has a final twist that almost no one knows, because sometimes the greatest triumph leaves behind the quietest names, and sometimes the people who win a war are the ones history forgets first. When the war ended in May of 1945, the men at the top faced a reckoning. The German military signed its unconditional surrender at Reims on May 7th, and the man who authorized it was Karl Dönitz, the same admiral who had sent the wolf packs west in 1942. In the final days, Hitler's testament had named Dönitz head of the entire Reich. He held that office for 8 strange days, presiding over a country that no longer existed before he too was arrested. At Nuremberg, on trial for the conduct of unrestricted submarine warfare, Dönitz did something few of the defendants managed. He conceded the truth. He admitted that by the middle of 1943 his campaign could no longer achieve its strategic goal. The arithmetic he had trusted had failed. He was sentenced to 10 years at Spandau prison, and he served every single day of it. But the number that followed Dönitz into that cell was not the tonnage he had sunk. It was the tonnage he had lost. 28,000 U-boat crewmen died during the war. Roughly 3 out of every 4 men who ever sailed in a German submarine never came home. It was one of the highest casualty rates of any fighting force in the entire conflict. And among those dead was Donitz's own son, Peter, killed aboard U-954 in the very battles of May 1943 that were destroying the fleet his father had built across a decade. The admiral who had promised that submarines could win the war buried his belief and his boy in the same terrible spring. He made no public statement. He simply continued to command, sending men out in boats he already knew were tombs. Albert Speer's reckoning was more explicit. Under questioning by Allied economists at Nuremberg, he confirmed the moment his faith had died. It was the summer of 1943 when his comparative production data no longer permitted any honest assessment of victory. He had known for nearly 2 years. He had kept the factories running anyway, dispersing them under the bombing, prioritizing fighters, requisitioning labor from occupied lands. His work extended the war by months. It saved not a single German from the outcome. Speer was sentenced to 20 years at Spandau, and he served them in the same prison as Dönitz, two men who had understood defeat long before their nation admitted it, and the men who had mocked the welded ship, the traditional shipbuilders who swore the hulls would crack and the amateurs would drown. They faded quietly into the record, their objections buried beneath 2,700 launched hulls. Henry Kaiser, the road builder, who knew nothing about ships and built them faster than anyone in history, became a national legend. His name attached to hospitals and factories long after the war. Emery Scott Land, the admiral who had shielded the ugly duckling when his own engineers begged him to stop, retired with the satisfaction of a man who had bet on numbers and won. But the welder, the nameless man whose scarred hand started this story, he simply went home. That is the heartbreaking truth at the center of this entire tale. The people who outbuilt the world were almost all of them ordinary. When the war ended, they took off their goggles, hung up their torches, and vanished back into the country they had saved. Some of the women who had welded battleship plate in Richmond and Baltimore were told to give their jobs back to returning men and go home to their kitchens. Some of the sharecroppers who had earned their first real wage in a shipyard returned to the fields. Most of them never received a medal. Most of them never appeared in a single document at Nuremberg or Reims. They did not command fleets or sign surrenders. They built the ships and then they disappeared, and yet their true legacy was never going to be found in medals or ranks. It was welded into the hulls themselves and into something far larger than any one war, because the method those welders proved, prefabrication, standardization welding, instead of riveting assembly line logic pointed at the sea, did not end in 1945. It became the foundation of the modern industrial world. Before the war, building anything enormous, a ship, a bridge, a building, meant slow craftsmanship by skilled hands. After the war, the world had learned a different lesson. Break the giant object into standardized pieces, build the pieces anywhere, and assemble them fast. The Liberty ship had been ugly and slow and mocked, but its DNA spread everywhere. Modern shipping runs on that DNA. The gigantic container ships that carry the global economy today are built in modular blocks, welded and assembled in exactly the way Kaiser's amateurs pioneered under wartime desperation. The prefabricated housing that rose across the world in the post-war boom borrowed the same principle. Even the great construction projects of the following decades, the standardized skyscrapers, the modular factories, owed a debt to the frantic yards of 1942 and 1943 that proved you did not need a lifetime of craftsmanship to build something vast. You needed a good design, a disciplined process, and 1,000 ordinary people, each taught to do one piece perfectly. The military lesson traveled even further. The Second World War had been at its heart a contest of production, and the side that could outbuild its enemy had won. That lesson was burned into American strategy for the rest of the century. In Korea, in Vietnam, and in every conflict since, the ability to manufacture and move material at overwhelming scale remained the quiet foundation beneath every battle. The logistics that the welders had made possible, the endless river of ships and trucks and supplies, became the American way of war. Armies do not run on courage alone. They run on the freighters that reach the port, on the fuel that reaches the tank, on the shell that reaches the gun. And the welders had proven that a democracy of ordinary people could build that river faster than any dictatorship of masters. Consider the scale of what they accomplished. In the first half of 1942, American yards launched 4 million tons of shipping. Between January of 1943 and June of 1944 alone, they launched 27 million tons, a figure that by itself exceeded every ship the U-boat sank in the entire war. Where a freighter once took 8 months to build, the average had fallen to 42 days, and in one stage demonstration, a complete ocean-going vessel slid into the water in under 5 days. The exchange rate at sea reversed so completely that the U-boats, which early in the war had lost 1 boat for every 100,000 tons they sank, were by late 1943 losing 1 boat for every 10,000 tons. Faster, larger, more relentless. The numbers did not just win a campaign. They defined an era. But the deepest lesson of this story was never really about welding or ships or even production. It was about something harder to build and easier to lose. It was about where good ideas come from and who is allowed to have them. The German High Command had made a reasonable assumption. American industry was real, they said, but distant, slow, and soft. A nation of shopkeepers and immigrants and squabbling politicians could not sustain a prolonged industrial war. They were not stupid men. Their reading of the previous war supported them. Their reading of American isolationism supported them. Every pre-war production record supported them. And they were catastrophically wrong because they had measured the wrong thing. They had counted the steel that already existed. They had never imagined what a free society could build when it decided to, or how quickly ordinary people, given the tools and the reason, could rewrite the rules that experts called permanent. That is the first lesson a good idea can come from anyone. From a road builder who knew nothing about ships. From a housewife who had never held a torch. From a sharecropper welding his first seam. The genius was not locked away in the traditional shipyards with their century of craft. It was scattered across a whole population waiting to be asked. The second lesson is darker, and it is about institutions. Why did the traditional shipbuilders fight the welded hull so bitterly? Why did the establishment resist the very method that would save them? Because institutions are built to protect what has worked before. Expertise, which is a strength in stable times, becomes a cage in a crisis. The men who had mastered riveting had every incentive to defend riveting, even as the ocean filled with the wreckage of ships that could not be replaced fast enough. It took a leader like Land willing to spend his credibility, and a president like Roosevelt willing to announce targets his own advisors called fantasy, to break that cage open. Innovation is rarely rejected because it is bad. It is rejected because it is unfamiliar, and because the people who benefit from the old way hold the power to say no. The third lesson is about courage. The courage to try something that everyone respectable calls reckless. To weld when the masters say rivet. To build a harbor on an open beach. To send bombers back over Schweinfurt after losing 60 in a single day because you have counted the replacements, and you know they are already coming. This kind of courage is not the courage of a single heroic charge. It is the slower, colder courage to bet on a number, to trust a process, and to endure the mockery until the results arrive. History is full of these crazy ideas that changed war. The tank was dismissed by cavalry officers who could not imagine steel replacing horses. Radar was doubted by admirals who trusted their own eyes over an invisible beam. The aircraft carrier was mocked by battleship men, certain that big guns would always rule the sea, right up until the moment carrier aircraft sank those very battleships. Each time an established institution protected the familiar, and each time reality eventually forced the door. The welded ship belongs in that company, not because it was the flashiest weapon of the war, but because it was the most decisive and the least glamorous. And the lesson has not aged. It lives in every modern argument between the experts who defend the proven way and the outsiders who see a faster one. It lives in every company disrupted by a garage startup, every industry transformed by someone who did not know the rules well enough to obey them. The welders of 1942 would recognize our world instantly because the fundamental contest has never changed. It is always the cathedral of expertise against the flood of ordinary ingenuity, and the flood given enough people and enough reason tends to win. But there is one final detail in this story that almost no one knows. A small thing, a physical thing that ties the entire war together in a way that feels almost designed. The ships were meant to be temporary. That was the whole point of the Liberty ship. They were emergency vessels built to a 5-year design life, expected to make a handful of Atlantic crossings and then be scrapped or sunk. They were the disposable answer to a desperate problem welded quickly, used hard, and never meant to last. Of the 2,700 hulls that crossed the ocean during the war, the vast majority were exactly that, temporary. They did their work, and they were gone, sold off, and cut up for scrap. In the decades that followed, their steel melted back into the world they had saved. And yet, one of them refused to disappear. The Jeremiah O'Brien was launched at South Portland, Maine in June of 1943, one of thousands of identical ugly ducklings pouring out of the wartime yards. She crossed the Atlantic. She served at Normandy, one of the anonymous freighters feeding that impossible tide of material onto the French coast. And when the war ended and her sisters went to the scrapyards, she survived by luck and by love, and by the stubbornness of people who refused to let the whole story be melted down. Today, the Jeremiah O'Brien is moored at Pier 45 in San Francisco. She is one of only 2 surviving Liberty ships out of the 2,700 that were built, the last operational originals of a fleet that changed the world. And here is the detail that gives you chills. Her engine still runs. The same reciprocating steam engine that carried her across a wartime ocean, built by a nation of amateurs in a shipyard that had been empty mud a few years earlier, still turns. On certain days, she sails out under the Golden Gate Bridge, under her own power. An 80-year-old ghost of the miracle carrying visitors across the same Pacific approaches her sisters once crossed with tanks and fuel and ammunition. Walk her decks, and you are walking through the proof of everything in this story. The welded seams the experts swore would crack, holding fast after 8 decades. The prefabricated simplicity the traditionalists mocked, still floating, while the elegant riveted ships of the old masters are long gone. She is not a monument built afterward to commemorate the dead. She is the real thing, the actual survivor, the last living piece of the flood that drowned the U-boat fleet and carried 1 million men to France. The welders who built her have nearly all passed on. Their names were never recorded. But their work still runs its engine in San Francisco Bay, and anyone who wants to can climb aboard and touch it. That is the twist the German High Command never saw coming. They thought the ships were the weak point, temporary, hastily built, unworthy of respect. It turned out the ships would outlive the Reich, outlive the wolf packs, outlive the admirals and the architects, and the entire theory that distance meant time and time favored Germany. The disposable weapon became the enduring one. The ugly duckling became the last one standing. So here is the whole story in a handful of sentences. From a nameless welder, with an idea the experts called reckless welding steel, where masters said to rivet to a machine that launched a complete ship every 42 days and 27 million tons in 18 months. Ordinary people, farmers and housewives and sharecroppers, proved that a free society could outbuild the greatest war machine on earth, not through genius locked in a few brilliant minds, but through the scattered ingenuity of a whole population finally asked to build. They reversed the Battle of the Atlantic, they carried 1 million men to Normandy, and they broke the belief of the German High Command that America could be kept away by an ocean. And the deepest truth of it is this: the German command was not defeated by a secret weapon or a single genius. They were defeated by the assumption that ordinary people do not matter, that industry is slow, that expertise cannot be improvised, that a nation of shopkeepers and immigrants would never fight. They lost because they underestimated the one thing that is impossible to see in a pre-war production record: what a free people will build when they decide the war is theirs. The submarines that once ruled the Atlantic rusted in their concrete pens on the French coast, pens too thick for any bomb to break, standing empty to this day. The admirals served their sentences in Spandau. The architect who counted the defeat lived out his 20 years, knowing he had seen the truth in 1943, and said nothing that mattered. But the ship the amateurs built still runs her engine in San Francisco Bay, and the method they proved still builds the world we live in. They told him it was reckless. They told him it would crack. They told him a welder was nobody, and his idea was madness, and that nobody multiplied by 1,000,000 outbuilt the greatest military machine in history, ended the second happy time forever, and helped win the largest war the world has ever known. The German High Command believed distance and time were on their side. In the end, the only thing that ran out of time was the belief that America could not fight forever, because it turned out she could. And it turned out the people who proved it never even needed to be famous to change the world.